Aloha everyone. I've broken the stroke up into 4 parts. There's the hinge, the catch, the power, and the release. This video describes the 4th and last part of the stroke, the release. I've already made videos describing the other 3 parts, and please refer to them for each of those parts. I consider the release the most important part of the stroke, far more important than the other 3 parts. The release is all about conserving your momentum and speed between strokes. Have you ever returned from a long paddle and you feel like you've been in a boxing match and you've been beat half to death when you step onto shore? That's usually the result of your crew, or just even one person in your crew, not having a good release between strokes. When you don't have a good release between strokes, you're not conserving your momentum and speed, and have to spend energy in the next stroke to make up the speed you lost in the previous release. Have you ever returned from a paddle and felt like the paddle was effortless, that you could paddle for another 10 miles? This is usually because everyone in the crew had a good release between strokes and was able to conserve the boat's momentum and speed during the paddle. The boat felt like it was gliding, and each stroke felt effortless. What's the difference between a good release and a bad release? A bad release is when you don't have your paddle in a position to be frictionless when you take it out of the water. Adding friction adds resistance to the canoe and slows it down. Just one person that does not have a good release will cause the canoe to slow down when they take their paddle out of the water. The next stroke will be used to make up the speed you lost when you killed the speed from the previous release. I call this the kill cycle. You stroke to make up the speed you lost, and then release to kill your speed. When you do this for hours, you'll feel like you've been in a boxing match and lost. When you have a frictionless release, the boat does not slow down and feels like it's gliding between strokes. Each stroke feels effortless. In this case, when you have a frictionless release, you stroke to maintain or increase your speed, and have a frictionless release to maintain your momentum and speed. I call this the glide cycle. Just one person with the kill cycle will cause the canoe to slow down between strokes. Even the steersman, when poking, needs to minimize having their blade in the water when the rest of the crew has taken their blade out of the water. When poking, make steering corrections as quickly as possible and release with the rest of the crew. Having your blade in the water at any angle other than horizontal will create more friction when you take it out of the water. Your weight will act as a resistive force on the paddle as you take it out of the water. So how do you have a bad release? Having your blade in the water at any angle other than near horizontal will create more friction. At the end of the power phase, your top hand should be on the gunnel. So if I take my paddle out of the water at that time, my entire blade is still in the water. And by taking it out, I'm actually putting pressure forward, so slowing down the canoe. Now, the less angle I have on the blade, the less friction there will be when I take it out of the water. So in order to have the least amount of friction, it would be for the blade to be floating on top of the water. If my blade is in the water at all when I go to take it out, not only is there tension from water tension grabbing onto the blade, but there's also friction from going forward with the blade, drawing it out of the water, because the water is rushing past against my blade. That's the definition of a bad release. Drawing your paddle out when it's not in the position of the least resistance. And the least resistance is when your blade is near horizontal. So how do you perform a good release? At the end of the power phase, both feet should be in front of you. Your top hand should be at the gunnel at the end of the power phase. Your bottom hand should be near your hip. You should be sitting up with your shoulders square and with a slight forward lean. Now, in order to make the release, you want to, from the end of the power phase, you want to continue sweeping your hands back along the gunnel. And you'll see that my blade becomes horizontal. And actually, if I was in the canoe, you would feel the blade floating on top of the water. So you're sweeping both hands back until your top hand hits your hip. And you want to be, at the same time, you want to be turning your shoulders a quarter turn with an upper thoracic turn. Okay, this shoulder turn will force your opposite hip to go forward, pushing your heel forward, adding an extra boost of force forward from your opposite hip. Keep your weight forward as you complete the release. Don't shift your weight to your butt and put weight into the canoe. You want to keep forward. You always want to feel your heels and your feet, the weight on your heels and feet. You don't want to feel the weight transfer to your butt and put weight in the canoe and make it push down in the water, which causes more resistance. As you make the sweep, I like to give a quick push with my top hand to break the water tension on the blade so it's easier to pull out, less friction. Then you break your elbow, pulling the paddle up, and return for the next stroke. Turning your shoulders back has an extra added advantage to the person behind you. It gives a clear visual cue for that person to adjust their stroke timing to match your timing. When will you notice a good release the most during a paddle? What I find is that during a turn, when you have a very good release, you turn faster. When you're trying to catch a wave, often your stroke rate will increase. When you increase your stroke rate, people get anxious and they start lifting their paddle out of the water before it's in a release position. So don't succumb to that anxiousness. Always perform the complete release. You want your paddle in a position of the least friction. Another area that I noticed that the release makes a difference is when you're trying to pass another canoe. Often your stroke rate increases. When your stroke rate increases, people get anxious and they start lifting their paddle out of the water before they complete their release. So you get into the kill cycle. Try to avoid this anxiousness and always complete the release cycle and continue the glide cycle. When you get anxious and release early before your paddle is in a good position, you start the kill cycle. So all you're doing is trying to recover the speed you lost when you had a bad release. Okay, this concludes my videos on the 4 parts of the stroke. I hope you've enjoyed watching them. Aloha, everyone.